Part 1. A sky darkened. The birth of the endless winter. It began with a sound no one in Europe heard, a roar across the oceans. A blast so violent it ripped the very heart out of a mountain. On April 10, 1815, Mount Tambora, a volcano on the distant island of Sumbawa in the Dutch East Indies, exploded in one of the most catastrophic eruptions in recorded history. The mountain, once over 14,000 feet high, collapsed in upon itself, spewing tens of cubic miles of ash, pumice, and sulfur into the stratosphere. For weeks, darkness covered the surrounding islands. Ships hundreds of miles away reported showers of ash, floating islands of pumice, and sunsets stained in otherworldly crimson. The world, however, had not yet begun to understand what had been set in motion. The explosion of Tambora would not merely scar a single island. It would reach across oceans and continents, twist weather patterns, and leave millions in misery. By 1816, it would shroud the northern hemisphere in an eerie, frigid gloom, a year that would come to be remembered as the year without summer. The calm before the storm. Europe, in 1815, was a continent cautiously exhaling after decades of war. Napoleon Bonaparte had finally been defeated at Waterloo in June. The cannons had ceased their relentless thunder, and the crowned heads of Europe were reassembling the world in their image at the Congress of Vienna. Farmers, weary of conscription and scorched earth tactics, looked to the soil once more for sustenance rather than survival. There was a fragile optimism in the air, a belief that, perhaps, the worst was behind them. But nature had little care for human politics. Across the Atlantic, in the young United States, farmers prepared for another growing season, their plows cutting into spring earth with expectations of abundance. In Canada, settlers pushed westward, braving harsh forests in hopes of fertile land. Even in distant China and India, the rhythms of agriculture carried on as they had for centuries. The earth turned, the seasons changed, or so everyone assumed. Above their heads, however, the world's climate was already shifting. Tambora's eruption had injected a vast veil of sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere. At high altitudes, these particles formed aerosols that scattered sunlight back into space, invisible, silent, and slow-moving. This blanket of ash and gas began to dim the sun itself. The first signs of an unnatural year. In early 1816, winter in Europe lingered longer than usual. Snowfall persisted in March, and frosts struck even as April approached. Still, such oddities were not unheard of. Farmers grumbled, priests prayed, but life continued. By May, however, whispers of something stranger began to spread. In New England, farmers rose one morning to find their fields white with frost, a killing frost, the kind that blackens young shoots and renders an entire season's planting worthless. Ice. In May, one Massachusetts diary exclaimed in disbelief. The temperature plummeted again in June, and on the morning of June 6, 1816, residents of Vermont and New Hampshire awoke to a sight that seemed like an ill-timed jest of nature. Snow, not a dusting, but inches deep, blanketing hills and rooftops in what should have been the height of spring. In Europe, the story was no different. The Rhine Valley endured unrelenting cold and rain. In Ireland, farmers reported crops failing to sprout at all, drowned by endless downpours. In France, vineyards, so recently restored after the ravages of war, stood withering in gray skies and persistent chill. And in Switzerland, where summer was already brief, there was simply no summer at all, just a season of perpetual autumnal gloom. The human cost emerges. The true horror of the year without summer lay not in snow in June or gray skies, but in hunger. Agriculture was, and remains, an enterprise at the mercy of weather. In 1816, it was an enterprise doomed. In the United States, the cold destroyed corn crops across New England. Farmers who had managed to plant again after the May frosts saw their fields annihilated by further freezes in July and August. Prices for surviving grain soared. Desperate families slaughtered livestock they could no longer feed. Some migrated westward toward Ohio and beyond, in search of milder climates. This movement would later be called the Year of the Beggar. Europe's suffering was even greater. With its denser population and weaker post-war economy, famine spread like wildfire. In Ireland, already impoverished, the potato crop failed yet again, leading to mass starvation. In Germany, peasants scoured forests for edible roots, nettles, and even grass to stave off death. In parts of Switzerland, reports surfaced of families boiling bark to make a thin, bitter soup. Food riots erupted in the streets of England and France. In Saxony, mobs attacked bakeries, and in London, Parliament debated how to quell bread uprisings. The atmosphere of despair was palpable. Clergy proclaimed that the unusual weather was divine retribution, a final judgment upon sinful humanity. Prophets and charlatans alike gained followers with promises of salvation or predictions of apocalypse. The sun has died, one German pamphlet proclaimed. The end is near. Art in the shadow of despair, and yet, amidst the misery, the year without summer birthed strange and enduring legacies. In Switzerland, on the shores of Lake Geneva, a group of young writers found themselves trapped indoors by relentless rain and chill. Among them were Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Mary Godwin, soon to be Mary Shelley. One storm-lashed evening, Byron proposed they each write a ghost story to pass the dreary hours. Out of that, Part 2, A World in Hunger, Europe and America on the Brink. The snows that had buried Europe in May and June of 1816 were not a passing curiosity. They were the opening act of a slow-motion catastrophe. As summer stubbornly refused to arrive, it became clear that the world was sliding into famine. The volcanic ash and sulfuric aerosols from Mount Tambora had dimmed the sun across the globe, but nowhere were the effects felt as cruelly as in Europe and North America, lands already teetering from years of war, political upheaval, and economic strain. Europe's agony. From battlefield to barrenness. Europe in 1816 was a continent nursing its wounds. The Napoleonic Wars had ended barely a year earlier, leaving cities in ruins, farms neglected, and entire regions destitute. Now, the fragile peace was threatened not by muskets and cannon fire, but by the relentless hand of nature. In France, fields of wheat failed to ripen. By July, Parisian markets were scenes of desperation. Bread prices doubled, then tripled. Bakers guarded their shops against riots. In the countryside, peasants gnawed on boiled nettles and grass. Diaries from rural France record heartbreaking scenes: a mother in Normandy who sold her last 2 hens for a handful of flour, a priest in Burgundy who buried 6 children in 1 week, all dead from fever of the stomach, a euphemism for starvation. Britain fared little better. In Ireland, the potato crop, the lifeblood of the peasantry, rotted in the cold, wet soil. Reports from County Mayo spoke of entire families abandoning their cottages to wander the roads, begging for crusts of bread. In England, the industrial cities of Manchester and Birmingham faced their own crisis. Without grain imports from Europe, food prices soared, fueling strikes and unrest. The government, fearing revolution, deployed troops to disperse angry mobs shouting, "Bread or blood." Even Germany, land of fertile plains, suffered. The Elbe and Rhine valleys, normally green with summer crops, lay sodden and empty. The price of rye in Leipzig tripled within months. In Switzerland, where alpine villages depended on fragile pastures, livestock starved. In desperation, families slaughtered their cows prematurely, selling the hides and eating the tough, lean meat act that left them without milk or future sustenance. 2. The American struggle. Summerless New England across the Atlantic. The United States faced its own nightmare. In New England, the summer months of 1816 became infamous as 1800 and froze to death. Frost struck in June, killing young corn and beans. In July, farmers woke to find ice on their horse troughs. By August, another killing frost swept across the region, blackening fields that had just begun to recover. In Vermont, one farmer wrote, "We plant, it dies. We plant again, it dies. God help us all." The region, already sparsely populated, saw a mass exodus westward. Thousands abandoned their rocky farms for the promise of Ohio, Indiana, and beyond. Townships emptied almost overnight, leaving behind shuttered homes and untended fields. Elsewhere, the shortages sparked social tension. In Boston, mobs attacked grain merchants accused of hoarding. In Albany, New York, the state militia was called to keep order when bread prices doubled in a week. Even in the burgeoning cities of the mid-Atlantic, once insulated by trade, hunger gnawed at the poor. 3. Canada and the Maritime Provinces. Starvation on the frontier north of the United States, British North America, Canada, faced its own reckoning. The Maritime Provinces, reliant on fishing and small-scale farming, were particularly hard hit, with fish stocks mysteriously declining, likely due to altered ocean currents from the volcanic eruption. Coastal villages turned inland for sustenance, only to find barren fields. Nova Scotia's governor recorded in August, "The people are in a state of near rebellion. They cry for bread, but there is none to give." Inland, in Upper Canada, modern Ontario, settlers fought a different battle. Their isolation meant they could not easily purchase food from elsewhere. Families survived on boiled bark, acorns, and the occasional rabbit. Entire communities resorted to barter economies: a few pounds of flour traded for labor, a bushel of turnips exchanged for shoes. The winter of 1816 to 1817 promised to be one of the harshest on record, and many knew they would not live to see spring. For the global ripple, India, China, and beyond, while Europe and America reeled, the famine was no less severe elsewhere. In India, the monsoon failed disastrously. Fields of rice withered, leading to cholera outbreaks that would, in time, spread across continents. In China, the Yangtze River basin saw relentless flooding, destroying what little crops had managed to grow under the dimmed sun. The global nature of the crisis baffled contemporary observers. Without modern meteorology, few understood that a single volcano in Indonesia could cast a veil of dust around the entire world. To many, the catastrophe seemed divine in origin, a punishment from God for the sins of nations. Social unrest. Seeds of change. The hunger did more than empty bellies. It fueled discontent that would shape the decades to come. In England, the hardships contributed to the rise of radical political movements demanding reform. In Ireland, the famine sowed seeds of resentment that would fester for generations. In North America, the westward migration spurred by the year without summer accelerated the nation's expansion, forever altering its demographic and political landscape by the close of 1816. One truth had become unavoidable. The world was in crisis. Winter loomed again, and with food stores depleted, the coming months promised only more death. The endless winter was not just a season, it was a sentence, and humanity was only beginning to serve. Part 3. Disease, Desperation, and Darkness. By the late summer of 1816, what little hope people had managed to cling to was fading fast. Crops had failed again. Frost had bitten the earth in July. Livestock was dying, not just from starvation, but from disease spreading through malnourished herds. And where famine stalks, pestilence is never far behind. This was the point at which the year without summer became not just a climate anomaly, but a true humanitarian catastrophe. Across Europe and North America, hunger gave way to illness. Communities once known for their resilience began to unravel as despair set in. The shadow of pestilence in 1816, medicine was still a crude affair. The germ theory of disease was decades away. Doctors spoke of miasmas, bad air causing sickness, and while they were often wrong in specifics, they were right in noticing that squalor bred death, and squalor was everywhere. Crowded barns and stables that once held healthy cattle now reeked of decay, filled with the carcasses of animals that had starved in the endless cold. Farmers were often forced to butcher their own workhorses, leaving them without the means to plow what fields might still produce. Villages stank of rot, attracting swarms of flies, breeding grounds for dysentery and typhoid. In Ireland, already struggling with chronic poverty, fever swept through the countryside. In Germany, hunger typhus became a dreaded term, as families too weak to bury their dead left bodies uncollected. Even in the wealthier cities of France and England, cholera-like outbreaks flared as poor sanitation met unprecedented misery. America's frontier under siege. In North America, the devastation was no less severe. Vermont and parts of New England, hit hardest by the cold, saw entire towns abandon farming altogether. Families loaded what little they owned into wagons and struck west, seeking more forgiving climates beyond the Ohio River. Those who stayed behind often starved or succumbed to disease. The famous preacher Lyman Beecher recorded in his journal the haunting scenes he witnessed. "I saw a child, no more than 5 years of age, gnawing on a piece of boiled leather. The mother wept, for she had nothing else to give." With food scarce, communities turned to desperate measures. Acorns, tree bark, and boiled nettles became staples. In some cases, family pets were slaughtered for sustenance. Disease followed inevitably: scurvy from lack of vegetables, dysentery from tainted water, and fevers from crowded, weakened populations. The collapse of social order. When hunger and illness grip a population, social order begins to fray. In 1816, reports of theft and violence increased dramatically. In Switzerland, once proud mountain farmers resorted to raiding lowland villages for grain. In England, bread riots became commonplace, with angry crowds smashing bakery windows and seizing loaves. Governments, fearing revolt, responded with force. Soldiers were dispatched to guard granaries. In parts of Germany, martial law was imposed. The wealthy hoarded food, further inflaming resentment. Yet, amid the cruelty, there were also moments of quiet heroism. Churches and charities did what they could, distributing what little they had. In Paris, a group of nuns known as the Daughters of Charity opened their convent to house orphans of the famine. In Vermont, farmers who still had surplus shared with neighbors at great personal cost. The darkness within, as the physical world seemed to darken, skies choked with volcanic ash, days often as dim as dusks, so too did the human spirit waver. Suicide rates spiked, particularly among farmers who had lost everything. In Geneva, a young woman named Mary Shelley, trapped indoors by the unending rain, began to write a story about a scientist who creates life from death. The novel would later be known as Frankenstein, a fitting testament to the era's Gothic despair. The arts across Europe reflected this mood. Painters turned to bleak landscapes. Composers produced mournful works. The sense that nature itself had turned hostile weighed heavily on the human psyche. Too many it felt like divine punishment or wrath from heaven. Preachers proclaimed that the end times were upon them, and in some places, desperate crowds gathered in fields to pray for deliverance. A glimmer of resistance despite everything: the hunger, the disease, the despair. Human beings proved stubbornly unwilling to vanish. Communities, though battered, began to adapt. Farmers experimented with hardier crops like potatoes and turnips. Fishing increased in coastal areas, providing crucial protein. Some governments began to invest in new methods of food storage and transport, laying early groundwork for what would later become modern food security. Still, by the winter of 1816, the world was not yet through the worst of it. The sickness continued, the cold lingered, and the global system remained on the brink of collapse. The final chapter of this saga would be one of transformation but also of irreversible loss. For many, the year without summer had already taken too much. Part 4. Ashes and Awakening. How the world emerged from the year without summer. The winter that began in the summer of 1816 seemed endless. By the dawn of 1817, the world bore the scars of catastrophe. Skeletal cattle bleached in barren pastures, fields left uncultivated for lack of seed, and graveyards swollen with the victims of hunger and disease. Yet within this bleakness, whispers of recovery began to stir. The year without summer, as it would later be known, had left humanity broken but also irrevocably transformed. The world would never be the same. 1. The turning of the seasons. Nature's slow return. In early 1817, the skies over Europe began to clear. The sulfuric veil that had shrouded the sun, a lingering gift of Mount Tambora's fury, slowly dissipated. For the first time in over a year, the days seemed to hold warmth again. In England, farmers cautiously sowed barley and oats, their hearts heavy with the memory of last year's loss. "If God grants us just one good harvest," wrote a Hampshire farmer in his diary, "perhaps we may yet survive." Across the Atlantic, New Englanders who had endured snow in June and frost in August the year prior watched with relief as spring arrived with honest green rather than the bitter gray of ash and ice. Children played outdoors again, and ships carrying grain began to dock in Boston and New York, bringing much-needed relief from Canada, the Caribbean, and even far-off Russia. But the scars of famine did not heal easily. Fields had been abandoned, livestock slaughtered, and countless communities displaced. Recovery would not be a single season's gift, it would take years. 2. The human cost. What survival meant. Surviving 1816 had left psychological wounds as deep as the physical. Hunger had forced neighbors to steal from one another, parents to make impossible choices, and entire towns to depend on charity. In Switzerland, where famine had struck hardest, stories of cannibalism were whispered but never confirmed, tales that revealed the depth of desperation. Many never returned to their homelands. The famine had pushed thousands of Europeans to migrate, some to the cities, where industrialization offered a fragile promise of wages, others across the Atlantic to America, whose lands, though scarred by the cold, had not endured Europe's crushing starvation. The mass migrations of 1817 and beyond would reshape demographics and fuel the growing urban centers of the modern age. 3. Scientific curiosity. Seeking answers in the sky. For centuries, famine and strange weather had been attributed to divine wrath or celestial omens. But in the aftermath of 1816, a new generation of scientists began to ask, what truly happened? Astronomers like the German Heinrich Wilhelm Olbers studied the strange dimming of the sun during the summer of 1816, suspecting volcanic activity far away. Reports of a massive eruption in the Dutch East Indies eventually reached Europe. A mountain called Tambora, little known to the Western world, had exploded in 1815 with a force 10 times greater than Krakatoa would decades later. The realization was staggering. An event on one island had altered climates across continents. This connection between volcanic eruptions and global climate marked a turning point in scientific thought. Meteorology and geology gained new significance, and the concept of interconnected global systems began to emerge. Humanity was learning, painfully, that the world's natural forces operated on a scale beyond human control but not beyond human understanding. For art, literature, and the shadow of 1816, out of tragedy, creativity often blooms. The gloom of 1816 had seeped into the arts in ways that would resonate for centuries. The gloomy days in Switzerland, where Mary Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Lord Byron huddled by a lakeside fireplace, gave birth to Frankenstein and the darkness, poems and stories that reflected a world fearful of extinction and despair. These works were not mere entertainment, they were mirrors of the age's anxiety, capturing the sense of a world teetering on the brink. In painting, artists like J.M.W. Turner would later immortalize the strange fiery sunsets caused by volcanic ash, their works unintentionally documenting the atmospheric fingerprints of Tambora. Nature's fury had become a muse as well as a terror. 5. Lessons learned and ignored. Did humanity learn from the year without summer? In some ways, yes. Governments began to consider food storage and relief systems more seriously. Agricultural societies promoted new techniques, and canals and railways were soon built to ensure that food could reach starving populations more quickly in the future. Yet in other ways, the lessons faded quickly. By the 1820s, Europe's political focus had shifted back to power struggles and empire building, and the suffering of 1816 became a distant memory for those who had not lived it. For the poor, however, the memory remained vivid proof that life could collapse in an instant, and that survival often depended on resilience, community, and luck more than on kings or parliaments. 6. The legacy of 1816.